Alright, settle in, friends. Tonight we're diving deep into a chilling chapter of history. 1888, Whitechapel, London. A place where gas lamps struggled to pierce the oppressive fog and the cobblestone streets echoed with desperation. Imagine a labyrinth of narrow alleys, overflowing with refuse and shadowed by crumbling tenements. The air itself hung thick with the stench of poverty, coal smoke, and something else, something far more sinister. This wasn't the London of Queen Victoria's glittering palaces and grand exhibitions. This was the forgotten underbelly, a breeding ground for despair, and the stage for an unfolding nightmare. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together, Whitechapel in 1888 was a world teetering on the edge. Overcrowding was rampant, disease festered, and unemployment was sky high. Thousands of impoverished souls, many of them recent immigrants seeking a better life, were crammed into squalid lodging houses. For many women, the only means of survival was prostitution, a dangerous profession, even in the best of times, and in Whitechapel, times were perpetually at their worst. The police force, already stretched thin, struggled to maintain order in this chaotic environment. Corruption was rife, and justice often felt like a distant dream. And it was into this environment of crushing poverty and social decay that a predator emerged, a figure who would forever be known as Jack the Ripper. The story begins, or rather the terror truly took hold, on August 31st, 1888. It was a Friday, a day that promised little respite from the grim realities of Whitechapel life. Around 3:40 a.m., a carman named Charles Cross was walking to work along Bucks Row, now Durward Street. Bucks Row, a seemingly ordinary street, was about to become infamous. As Cross made his way in the dim morning light, he noticed something lying on the ground in front of a stable entrance. He initially thought it was a tarpaulin, but as he drew closer, he realized with horror that it was a woman. She was lying on her back, her skirt pulled up, and he could see blood. A lot of blood. Cross, understandably shaken, sought help. He flagged down another carman, Robert Paul, who was also on his way to work. Together they approached the body. They could see that the woman was clearly dead. Paul touched her hand and confirmed she was cold. They hadn't seen the full extent of her injuries in the gloom, but knew enough to realize something terrible had occurred. These details really stick with me, you know, just the everyday normality of Charles and Robert's journeys, and then the horrifying finding. Without wasting any time, the two men went in search of a policeman, eventually finding one on Hanbury Street. This officer, PC Jonas Misen, rushed back to Bucks Row with them. It wasn't long before a small crowd started to gather, drawn by the commotion. The victim was soon identified as Mary Ann Nichols, but she was also known as Polly. Polly Nichols was 43 years old, a woman worn down by hardship and addiction. She was a known prostitute, struggling to make ends meet in the unforgiving streets of Whitechapel. Like so many others in that area, Polly had seen better days. She'd been married, had children, but her life had spiraled downwards due to alcoholism and misfortune. On that fateful night, she'd been turned away from her lodging house because she lacked the 4 pence needed for a bed. "Never mind," she reportedly said. "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a bonnet I have got now." Those were some of the last words anyone heard from Polly. It's just heartbreaking to know of the circumstances leading up to her murder. Dr. Llewellyn, the local police surgeon, arrived at the scene to examine Polly's body. The examination revealed a brutal truth. Polly Nichols hadn't simply died, she had been murdered, and the nature of her injuries suggested something far more sinister than a simple robbery gone wrong. 2 deep cuts ran across her throat, almost severing her head from her body. There were also multiple abdominal wounds. The wounds were deep and jagged, suggesting a large sharp knife had been used with considerable force and a level of anatomical knowledge, although not nearly to the extent that later murders revealed. Dr. Llewellyn later testified that the murder had been committed by someone who possessed considerable surgical skill. The killer was methodical, precise, and utterly ruthless. Polly Nichols' murder wasn't just a crime, it was a carefully orchestrated act of savage brutality. News of Polly Nichols' murder spread quickly through Whitechapel, igniting a spark of fear that would soon erupt into a raging inferno of terror. At first, the reaction was one of shock and disbelief. Murder was sadly not uncommon in Whitechapel, but the sheer savagery of this crime was unprecedented. People whispered about it in hushed tones, wondering who could be capable of such a monstrous act. The fear stemmed from more than just the horrible mutilations. It stemmed from the fact there was a possibility of anatomical knowledge. It really upped the ante for the local residents. The local newspapers, sensing a sensational story, jumped on the case, publishing graphic details of the murder and fueling public anxiety. The East London Advertiser and other papers printed lurid accounts of Polly Nichols' injuries, speculating about the killer's motives and background. Some suggested the killer was a madman, driven by insane impulses. Others theorized that he was a disgruntled doctor or butcher, using his professional skills for evil purposes. As more and more details emerged, the fear in Whitechapel began to intensify. People started locking their doors earlier, avoiding dark alleys, and walking in groups for safety. The streets, once bustling with activity, became eerily quiet after dark. The local police force, already under immense pressure, struggled to reassure the public. They promised a thorough investigation, but many residents felt they were ill-equipped to deal with such a sophisticated and brutal killer. The murder of Polly Nichols was more than just a tragedy. It was a turning point for Whitechapel. It shattered the illusion of safety, exposing the vulnerability of the area's residents and ushering in an era of fear and paranoia that would grip the community for years to come. It was the opening act in a drama that would capture the world's attention and leave a lasting stain on the pages of history. The name Jack the Ripper hadn't yet been uttered, but the seeds of terror had been sown. Whitechapel was about to enter a living nightmare, and this was only the beginning. Alright, so let's dive into the murky world of Victorian London and follow in the footsteps of one of its most determined police officers, Inspector Frederick Aberline. Imagine, if you will, late 1888. The gas lamps of Whitechapel cast long, dancing shadows, barely piercing the thick fog that clings to the cobbled streets. The air is heavy with the smells of coal smoke, rotting vegetables, and something else, something metallic and unsettling. The discovery of Mary Ann Nichols' body has sent a chill down the spine of London, and the Metropolitan Police are under immense pressure to find her killer. Enter Inspector Aberline. He's not your typical Victorian detective, all bluster and bravado. He's a man of quiet determination, a seasoned investigator with a sharp mind and an even sharper eye. Think of him as the antithesis of Sherlock Holmes, less eccentric genius, more pragmatic and methodical. Aberline had worked his way up through the ranks, starting as a beat constable. He knew the East End like the back of his hand, knew the labyrinthine alleyways and the characters that haunted them. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, to pound the pavement, and to listen to the whispers on the streets. That's what made him a top choice for the case. But even for Aberline, this case was different. The brutality of the crime, the complete lack of obvious motive, and the sheer panic it ignited made it an uphill battle from the start. He quickly assembled a team of detectives, men he trusted and respected, and they began the arduous task of gathering evidence. The initial investigation was a whirlwind of activity. Witnesses were interviewed, lodging houses were searched, and every inch of the crime scene was meticulously examined. But the problem was they were drowning in information, yet starved for actual leads. You see, Whitechapel in 1888 was a melting pot of poverty, crime, and desperation. It was a place where anonymity was easy and secrets were commonplace. The police were faced with a population that was often distrustful, unwilling, or simply unable to help. Many residents were immigrants, struggling to survive and wary of authority. Others were involved in petty crime or prostitution, further complicating the investigation. Imagine trying to piece together a puzzle when half the pieces are missing and the other half are deliberately misleading. That's the situation Abberline and his team found themselves in. One of the biggest challenges was the lack of reliable witnesses. The murder had occurred in the early hours of the morning, and the area was sparsely populated at that time. Those who claimed to have seen something often gave conflicting accounts, fueled by fear, alcohol, or simply a desire for attention. One witness might describe a tall, dark man lurking in the shadows, while another swore they saw a woman running away from the scene. And then there was the press. The media of the Victorian era was just as sensationalist as it is today, if not more so. Newspapers eagerly seized on the story, whipping up public hysteria with lurid details and speculative theories. This constant media scrutiny put even more pressure on the police, and it also made it harder to conduct a proper investigation. Potential witnesses were often scared off by the intense media attention, and rumors spread like wildfire, further muddying the waters. The investigation was further hampered by the limitations of Victorian-era forensics. In 1888, crime scene investigation was still in its infancy. There was no DNA analysis, no fingerprinting, and no sophisticated methods of blood spatter analysis. The police had to rely on their own observations and intuition, and on the often unreliable testimony of witnesses. Abberline himself was a meticulous investigator, always looking for patterns and connections. He spent countless hours poring over crime scene photos, studying witness statements, and consulting with medical experts. He was particularly interested in the killer's methods, the way he selected his victims, and the specific injuries he inflicted. But despite his best efforts, the leads kept running cold. They investigated numerous suspects from local vagrants to known criminals, but none of them seemed to fit the profile of the killer. They followed up on countless tips and rumors, chasing shadows down dead ends. The frustration was palpable. Abberline was a man of duty, driven by a strong sense of justice. The failure to catch Nichols' killer weighed heavily on him. He knew that with each passing day, the killer was becoming bolder, more confident, and more likely to strike again. The pressure was immense. It's a feeling any detective can relate to, even today. One aspect that made Abberline stand out was his empathy. He wasn't just interested in catching a killer, he cared about the victims and the communities they came from. He understood the desperation and vulnerability of the women who lived and worked in Whitechapel, and he felt a personal responsibility to protect them. This empathy fueled his determination, even when the investigation seemed hopeless. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation stalled. The police were no closer to catching the killer than they had been on day one. The public was growing increasingly impatient and fearful. The press was relentless, and Abberline found himself under constant scrutiny. The weight of the case was beginning to take its toll. Despite the setbacks, Abberline refused to give up. He continued to follow every lead, to question every witness, and to analyze every piece of evidence. He was driven by a belief that somewhere in the labyrinth of Whitechapel, the key to solving the mystery lay hidden. He just needed to find it. And so the investigation continued, shrouded in fog, suspicion, and the chilling shadow of a killer who would soon become known as Jack the Ripper. It's a story etched in history, and Abberline's name is forever linked to that dark chapter. Okay, so Whitechapel, already a powder keg of poverty, crime, and simmering social unrest. Then, bang, Mary Ann Nichols is found. But some dismissed it. A robbery gone wrong, maybe. Horrible, tragic, but seemingly isolated. The thing is, the fear, it was already there. The newspapers, they started sniffing around, of course, but it wasn't a full-blown frenzy. Not yet, just a kind of unease. Then came Annie Chapman, September 8th, 1888. Less than a week after Nichols, a Sunday morning, a carter named John Davis stumbled upon her body in a backyard on Harmbury Street in Spitalfields, just a few streets away from the first murder. And this was different. This was deliberate. Gone was the relatively simple, if anything about murder can be called simple, brutality of Nichols. Annie Chapman's murder was vicious. Her throat was cut, of course, like Nichols, but her abdomen had been opened. Viscera was exposed and parts were missing. It was surgical, almost. The police, they were immediately way more involved, and so was the press. Think about it. 2 murders, incredibly close together, incredibly brutal. The first you could maybe explain away. A mugging gone south. This one, this smacked of something else, something darker, something organized. And the newspapers, they are going wild over it. Suddenly Whitechapel, it's a story that sells. Remember, this is the Victorian era. Society is obsessed with respectability, with order. And here you have this uncontrollable violence erupting in the heart of London's underbelly. It's captivating in a horrifying way. Newspapers started printing details, gruesome details, of the murder. Exaggerated, sensationalized, of course. They needed to sell papers. But even the kernel of truth within those articles, that was enough to send shivers down the spines of people all over the country. Suddenly, every shadow was sinister. Every alley held a potential monster. The police, initially overwhelmed, started to ramp up their presence. More officers on the streets, more patrols at night. Inspector Frederick Aberline, remember him from the Nichols case? He's now leading the investigation full force, but he's facing a wall of problems. No real witnesses, conflicting accounts, the sheer scale of Whitechapel, its labyrinthine streets and overcrowded tenements. It was like trying to find a single drop of blood in a river of it. And the public? Well, they were terrified. Vigilante groups start forming. Armed citizens patrolling the streets at night, hunting for, what? A shadow? A phantom? They were more likely to hurt an innocent person than to catch the killer, probably. But their fear? That was very, very real. The lodging houses, normally bustling with activity, started to empty out as quickly as possible. People are sleeping in shifts. Some women who worked the street, they refused to go out alone. It was like a plague of fear had settled over Whitechapel. And the newspapers, they're fueling the fire. Every new detail, every rumor, every theory, it's all printed, dissected and amplified. The public, it's demanding answers, demanding action. And the police, they're under immense pressure to find someone, anyone, to stop this madness. The media starts to suggest the murders are the work of a single individual, a fiend, a monster. Some papers were calling him the Whitechapel murderer. The name wasn't sticking. Not yet, but the idea of a single lurking predator that was taking root in the public consciousness. Think about the social context here though. Victorian society, it was hierarchical, very much so. There was the respectable middle and upper classes, and then there was everyone else, the poor, the working class, the immigrants. Whitechapel was full of those everyone else types. So many in the respectable classes, they saw Whitechapel as this almost separate world, a dark, dangerous place, filled with vice and squalor. The press, they really used that. They played on that fear. These murders, they weren't just crimes, they were a sign that the social order was breaking down, that the underclass, they were rising up. It wasn't necessarily true, but that's the narrative that a lot of people buy into. The police were facing another issue. They weren't exactly known for their sensitivity. Many of the officers, they came from the same social classes as the people they policed, not from Whitechapel at all. This created a huge amount of distrust. The women that the Ripper targeted, prostitutes, and the police, they often viewed them with contempt. It made the investigation so much harder. The Ripper's victims were already living on the margins. Their lives were already seen as disposable by many. That made it all the more difficult to get witnesses. People were afraid to talk. They didn't trust the police. And honestly, it wasn't always a rational choice for those people. Because who would they go to? Also, the newspapers, while amplifying the fear, they were also hindering the investigation. Printing rumors, printing speculation. It was making it really difficult for the police to separate fact from fiction. Anyone can say anything, and now it's in the paper, and the papers are gospel for people. The pressure was immense. Annie Chapman's murder, it wasn't just another murder, it was the spark that ignited the Ripper panic. It was the moment when the newspapers really started to shape the narrative. The moment when the fear became a tangible force in Whitechapel. And it was the moment when the world started to pay attention to a dark corner of London and the monster that lurked within. It was a terrifying moment, and it was about to get a whole lot worse. Alright, settle in, because this next part is pretty key to understanding the whole Jack the Ripper story. We're diving into the Dear Boss letter, arguably the most famous piece of Ripper correspondence, and honestly, a huge part of what solidified the Jack the Ripper persona in the public's mind. Before this letter, the Whitechapel murders were just horrific, unthinkable acts of violence, but they were, in a way, still disconnected. The Dear Boss letter, though, it changed everything. It gave the killer a voice, or at least, what seemed like a voice. It was postmarked September 27, 1888, and received by the Central News Agency in London. Now picture this, a busy newsroom, papers flying everywhere, the clatter of typewriters, and then this letter arrives, seemingly out of nowhere. The text itself, well, it's chilling. It starts, of course, with Dear Boss. Already, there's this unsettling familiarity, this almost casual tone, as if the writer is confiding in a colleague. It's creepy. Then the letter gets into the details. The writer brags about the recent murders, refers to the victims as squishers, and even promises more to come. Here's a bit of it. I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. My knife's so nice and sharp I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. It's important to remember that police at this point didn't even know if the murders were the work of a single person. I mean, there were copycats galore. This letter, though, it claimed responsibility. It unified the crimes under one singular banner. It suggested, pretty definitively, that one person was behind it all. And it didn't stop there. The writer even gave himself a name. He signed off as Jack the Ripper. That's it. Simple, direct, and utterly terrifying. Before, the press was calling him Leather Apron or the Whitechapel Murderer. But Jack the Ripper, that had a ring to it. A sinister, captivating ring. Now immediately, there was debate about the letter's authenticity. Was it genuine, a taunt from the killer himself? Or was it a hoax, a sick prank from some twisted individual trying to capitalize on the fear and chaos? The police, understandably, were skeptical. They'd received hundreds of letters claiming responsibility or offering clues. Most were obviously fake. But the Dear Boss letter, there was something about it that caught their attention. For one thing, it contained details about the murders that hadn't been widely publicized, information that presumably only the killer would know. This wasn't ironclad proof, mind you. It's possible someone connected to the investigation leaked some info, or maybe the person deduced it. The letter even stated the letter writer's desire to cut the ears off his victims and send them to the police. But the most significant aspect of the letter was its timing. It arrived just days before the double event, the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the same night, September 30th. And here's where it gets really interesting. In the Dear Boss letter, the writer said he would clip the ears off. The writer also mentions how he gave the lady no time to squeal, that if he was caught he would give you the double with some game kept back. Catherine Eddowes had part of her ear cut off, and the writer did give the double on the same night as he mentioned. It gave the letter a degree of credibility, making it harder to dismiss as a mere hoax. The impact on the investigation was huge. The police were under immense pressure to catch the killer, and the Dear Boss letter only amplified that pressure. They had to take it seriously, even if they suspected it was a fake. They analyzed the handwriting, the paper, the ink. They tried to trace the letter back to its source, but ultimately they came up empty. There was just nothing conclusive. But the real impact of the Dear Boss letter was on the public. It sparked a frenzy. The press went wild, printing excerpts from the letter, analyzing its every word, fueling the public's fear and fascination with the Ripper. Jack the Ripper became a household name, a boogeyman lurking in the shadows of Whitechapel. The letter created a character, a persona, that captured the public's imagination and continues to haunt us to this day. Think about it. Before the Dear Boss letter, the killer was just an anonymous predator, but after, he was Jack the Ripper, a cunning, mocking figure who taunted the police and reveled in his own brutality. It turned the whole thing into a sort of gruesome game. It's important to note that the name Jack the Ripper stuck because the police and the press kept saying it. It almost gave the killer the notoriety that he wanted. The letter also generated countless copycats. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be Jack the Ripper. Other letters started flooding the police and the press, all claiming to be from the killer. Most were obvious fakes, filled with inconsistencies and inaccuracies, but they only added to the confusion and chaos. In the end, the Dear Boss letter remains a mystery. Was it genuine? Was it a hoax? We'll probably never know for sure, but what we do know is that it transformed the Whitechapel murders from a series of brutal crimes into a terrifying legend. It gave the killer a name, a voice, and a place in history, and that in itself is a pretty dark and disturbing legacy. Alright, let's dive into a truly horrifying night in Whitechapel, a night that solidified the terror and cemented the legend of Jack the Ripper. We're talking about September 30th, 1888, a date that saw not one but two brutal murders attributed to the Ripper, a sequence of events often referred to as the double event. Buckle up, because this is where things get intense. Our first victim of this night was Elizabeth Stride, also known as Long Liz. She was a Swedish-born woman, 43 years old, and like many of the Ripper's victims, she was a prostitute, scraping by in the unforgiving streets of Whitechapel. Now, what makes Stride's case particularly interesting and somewhat frustrating for investigators is that her murder is in some ways different from the others. Around 12:35 a.m., a steward named Israel Schwartz reported seeing a man attack Stride outside a pub. Schwartz says he saw a man grab her, spin her around and throw her to the ground. Schwartz reported the man yelled something, then a second man appeared and the two men fled. He went to the police the next day, but this account was largely ignored. What we do know for sure is around 1 a.m., Louis D.M. Schutz, a steward, was driving his pony and cart down Dutfield's yard, which was a dark alleyway off Burner Street. He discovered Stride's body lying in the yard. Crucially, and this is where the mystery deepens, Stride's throat was cut, but that was seemingly it. There were no further mutilations to her body, just the throat wound, still bleeding fresh. Now, the police and of course, the public jumped to one of two conclusions, either that the Ripper was interrupted mid-kill and had to flee before he could complete his work, or that the killer was someone else entirely. Now, this first explanation, that he was interrupted, is certainly plausible. Burner Street was actually a relatively busy street, and Dutfield's yard led to a number of other buildings. Anyone could have stumbled upon the scene at any moment, which could have scared the Ripper off. Also, there were groups of people on the street attending a local meeting, and the noise may have made the Ripper nervous and eager to flee the scene as fast as possible. This is also what led some to believe that Stride was killed by someone else entirely. A drunken fight gone wrong, a disgruntled client, something like that. Someone with motive but without the same signature of the Ripper. It's true that it lacks the grotesque abdominal mutilations that became the Ripper's calling card, but the throat was cut from left to right, the same as the other murders. However, the lack of mutilation is what brings us to the second murder and the double event. Just under an hour later, at around 1:45 a.m., Police Constable Edward Watkins discovered the body of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square, which was quite a distance from Berner Street, closer to the City of London. Eddowes, 46 years old, was another prostitute, and her murder was markedly different than Stride's. It was also far more brutal. Eddowes' throat was cut, yes, but her abdomen was also ripped open, and her intestines were pulled out and placed over her right shoulder. Her left kidney and part of her uterus were missing. Her face was also horrifically mutilated, her nose was severed, and her cheeks were slashed. There were also cuts on her eyelids and neck. It was a scene of absolute carnage, even by the Ripper's standards. The location of Eddowes' murder, Mitre Square, was significant for a couple of reasons. First, it was within the City of London, putting it under the jurisdiction of the City of London Police, rather than the Metropolitan Police who were investigating the other murders. This created some jurisdictional friction, let's say, between the two forces. Second, and more chillingly, Mitre Square was very close to some of the most important buildings in London, including the Bank of England. The Ripper was, in effect, bringing his terror to the very heart of the establishment. Now, the proximity in time and the stark contrast between the Stride and Eddowes murders led investigators to believe they were both committed by the same person. The theory goes that the Ripper was interrupted during the Stride killing, and needing to finish the job, he sought out another victim relatively quickly. This then resulted in an even more savage attack on Catherine Eddowes, compensating for the Ripper's perceived failure with Stride. The double event had a devastating impact on Whitechapel. Panic, which had already been simmering, boiled over. The police were under immense pressure to catch the killer. Vigilante groups formed, patrols increased, and suspicion fell on anyone who looked even remotely suspicious. It was a time of fear, paranoia, and chaos. The next day, adding another layer of grim mystique to the case, a piece of Eddowes' apron was found near Gulston Street, not far from Mitre Square. On a nearby wall, there was a message scrawled in chalk. "I'll warn you, the content is pretty insensitive." It read, "The Jewers are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Now, this graffiti caused a major problem. The police feared that the message would incite anti-Semitic riots, as the East End had a large Jewish population, many being recent immigrants. Inspector Swanson, the lead investigator at the time, ordered the message to be erased, without even photographing it first. This decision has been heavily criticized by modern ripperologists, as the graffiti could have potentially provided a valuable clue to the killer's identity or motives. Was it written by the Ripper himself, trying to deflect blame onto the Jewish community? Or was it written by someone else entirely, capitalizing on the fear and anti-Semitism that was already prevalent in Whitechapel? We'll probably never know for sure. Either way, the Gulston Street graffiti only added to the already intense atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust. The double event remains one of the most significant and chilling chapters in the Ripper story. It was a night of unparalleled horror, a night that exposed the vulnerability of Victorian society and the terrifying potential for violence lurking in the shadows. It's a night that continues to haunt us today, a stark reminder of the dark secrets that lie buried beneath the cobblestone streets of Whitechapel. The fact that authorities erased a potential piece of the puzzle, the graffiti, only adds to the mystery and frustration that surrounds these crimes. Now, let's move on to those infamous letters. Alright, settle in folks, because this one's a doozy. We're diving deep into the mystery surrounding the From Hell letter, arguably the most disturbing piece of correspondence linked to Jack the Ripper. This letter, unlike the jokey Dear Boss missive, carries a chilling weight, and it's debated to this this day whether it's a genuine clue or just a particularly macabre hoax. What makes it so compelling? Well, for starters, it arrived with what appeared to be a piece of a human kidney. Yeah, really letting that sink in. The letter was mailed to George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, on October 16, 1888. Lusk's committee, formed by local residents, aimed to assist the police in their investigation, providing manpower and even offering rewards for information. So, receiving this would have been memorable. The letter itself is scrawled in uneven, almost shaky handwriting. The language is crude, boastful, and genuinely unsettling. It reads, "From hell, Mr. Lusk. Saw I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, pre-sarved it for you to the piece I fried and ate it. Was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can. Mr. Lusk." Charming, right? Now, let's break this down. The most immediate question is, was the kidney fragment real? And if so, did it come from Catherine Eddowes, the Ripper's fourth victim, who was murdered on September 30th, less than 3 weeks before the letter arrived? Police surgeons examined the kidney piece. Dr. Thomas Openshaw, a pathologist at the London hospital, concluded that it was indeed a human kidney, and specifically the left kidney. More significantly, he stated that it showed signs of Bright's disease, a kidney ailment. Catherine Eddowes, as confirmed by post-mortem examination, also had Bright's disease. Boom, right. Case closed? Not quite. While the presence of Bright's disease is certainly suggestive, it's not definitive proof. Bright's disease was relatively common in Victorian London, particularly among the poor who suffered from malnutrition and other health issues. So, while it narrows down the possibilities, it doesn't point exclusively to Eddowes. Furthermore, Dr. Openshaw noted that the kidney fragment had been preserved in spirits of wine, alcohol. This detail is crucial. It suggests that whoever sent the kidney had some basic anatomical or medical knowledge. A random lunatic wouldn't necessarily think to preserve a body part in alcohol. However, someone trying to convincingly fake being a medically knowledgeable serial killer might think of this. The location from where the letter was mailed raises questions too. It was postmarked from London's East Central District, a relatively wide area. This doesn't offer any specific leads, but it does tell us the sender was likely in London at the time. Now, let's talk about the letter itself. The spelling errors and grammatical mistakes could be genuine indicators of a poorly educated individual. However, they could also be deliberate attempts to feign illiteracy. Remember, the Ripper's letters were designed to taunt and mislead the police. Adding spelling errors could be a calculated effort to create a specific persona, that of a brutal, uneducated killer. Some experts have analyzed the handwriting, comparing it to other Ripper letters, particularly the Dear Boss letter. The general consensus is that there are some similarities, but not enough to definitively link them to the same author. Handwriting analysis in the Victorian era wasn't exactly a science, and even modern forensic handwriting experts often disagree on the conclusions. So, what are the possibilities here? Possibility #1. The letter is genuine. This would mean that Jack the Ripper actually removed a piece of Catherine Eddowes' kidney, preserved it, and mailed it to George Lusk as a gruesome trophy. If this were the case, it would offer a chilling insight into the Ripper's mindset, a desire to not only kill but also to possess and control, even after death. It would also solidify the idea that the Ripper had at least some medical or anatomical knowledge. Possibility #2. The letter is a hoax, but the kidney is from Catherine Eddowes. In this scenario, someone else obtained a piece of Eddowes' kidney, possibly after the post-mortem examination, and used it to create a sensational hoax. This person could have had access to the mortuary or known someone who did. The motive could have been anything from a twisted sense of humor to a desire for notoriety to intentionally throwing the police off course. Possibility #3. The entire letter is a hoax, including the kidney. This is perhaps the most likely scenario. Someone with a macabre fascination with the Ripper murders obtained a human kidney, possibly from a medical school or even a butcher shop. Remember, animal kidneys were readily available. They then crafted the disturbing letter, hoping to fool the public, and perhaps even the police. The mention of Bright's disease could have been a lucky guess, or the result of inside knowledge gleaned from gossip or news reports. So, where does that leave us? Honestly, nowhere definitive. The From Hell letter remains an enigma. The kidney fragment adds a disturbing layer of authenticity, but the possibility of a hoax, however elaborate, can't be ruled out. Ultimately, the From Hell letter serves as a chilling reminder of the Ripper's reign of terror and the enduring fascination and revulsion it continues to inspire. It's a dark artifact from a dark time, a testament to the power of fear and the enduring mystery of Jack the Ripper. Sleep tight, October 1888, a month already dripping in dread, but about to descend into a new circle of hell. We're talking, of course, about the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, November 9th, Miller's Court, Dorset Street, Spitalfields, a place that even in the cesspool of Whitechapel was considered, well, a cesspool within a cesspool. Mary Jane Kelly, a 25-year-old prostitute, known also as Fair Emma, was found murdered in her one-room dwelling, but found doesn't quite cover it. Discovered is perhaps more accurate, since what the police encountered went far beyond anything they'd witnessed before. Let's paint a picture, and I warn you, it's not pretty. The room itself, a squalid den of poverty, lit only by the dim glow of a flickering candle. The air thick with the stench of stale alcohol, unwashed bodies, and something far, far worse. Mary Jane lay on the bed, and here is where the horror truly begins. I'll spare you all the gruesome details, but know this, the brutality inflicted upon Mary Jane Kelly went beyond even the previous Ripper murders. It was surgical. Mutilation elevated to a gruesome art form, internal organs removed and carefully arranged, flesh stripped from bone. It was complete. I'm not going to go into the specifics, but to give you an idea, even hardened police officers, men who had seen the absolute dregs of humanity, were physically sickened. This wasn't just murder, it was a desecration, a visceral statement of utter contempt. The Ripper wasn't just killing, he was making some kind of statement, and it was an awful one. The sheer ferocity of the attack suggested something more than just cold-blooded murder. Some believe it indicated a descent into madness, a letting go of any semblance of control. Others theorize it was a calculated act, a grand finale designed to shock and terrify. Either way, Mary Jane Kelly's murder represented a turning point. News of the murder spread like wildfire. If previous killings had sparked fear, this ignited absolute pandemonium. Panic gripped London. The press, already in a frenzy, whipped the public into a state of near hysteria. Headlines screamed of the Ripper's depravity. Every shadow seemed to conceal a lurking monster. Every creak of the floorboards brought a shiver of dread. People were afraid to walk the streets alone, especially women. They boarded up windows, reinforced doors. Whitechapel became a virtual police state. Officers patrolled every street corner, searched every alleyway, but it was all for naught. The Ripper had vanished, leaving behind only a trail of terror and a room of unimaginable horror. The Mary Jane Kelly murder investigation was a massive undertaking. Detectives interviewed hundreds of witnesses, followed countless leads, yet it all led nowhere. The Ripper had become a ghost, a phantom haunting the streets of London. The police were utterly baffled. Frustration mounted. The public, desperate for answers, grew increasingly critical. The press, never ones to miss an opportunity for sensationalism, fueled the flames of discontent. They ran stories accusing the police of incompetence, of corruption, of simply not caring enough about the plight of the poor in Whitechapel. They printed letters, both genuine and fabricated, claiming to be from the Ripper himself, each one more lurid and terrifying than the last. Remember that Dear Boss letter we talked about? Well, the Ripper had cemented his place in infamy. His crimes inspired books, songs, and even stage plays. People were simultaneously repulsed and fascinated by the Ripper's mystique. He became a dark legend, a boogeyman lurking in the Victorian subconscious. The Ripper mania extended far beyond London. News of the killings reached every corner of the globe. People from all walks of life were captivated by the mystery, the horror, the sheer audacity of the crimes. Amateur sleuths emerged, offering their theories and insights. Psychics claimed to have visions of the killer's identity. Even Queen Victoria herself expressed her concern and demanded that the culprit be brought to justice. The Mary Jane Kelly murder was in many ways the climax of the Ripper saga. Not only was it the most gruesome of the canonical 5 killings, it also marked the peak of public obsession, a crescendo of fear, fascination and frustration. The city was on edge, the media was in hyperdrive, and the police were at their wits' end. They'd failed, they couldn't catch him, they couldn't protect the victims, and in the end that was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire affair. The Ripper had not only committed unspeakable acts of violence, but he had also exposed the vulnerability of Victorian society, the limitations of law enforcement, and the dark underbelly of a city struggling with poverty, inequality, and fear. The horror of Miller's Court wasn't just the horror within its walls, it was the horror that it revealed about the world outside. So things got pretty rough after Mary Jane Kelly. I mean, imagine living in Whitechapel back then. The air already thick with coal smoke and poverty, now laced with a terror you could practically taste. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every unfamiliar face a potential monster. The papers, of course, didn't help. They screamed about the Ripper, fueled the panic, and sold a whole lot of newspapers. It was a circus of fear, and Whitechapel was the center ring. Women were terrified to walk the streets alone, even during the day. Work dried up because people were too scared to go out. The businesses that did stay open were often empty shells. You've got to remember the social context too. Whitechapel was already struggling, overcrowding, unemployment, rampant alcoholism. It was a tinderbox. The Ripper just threw a match in. People started turning on each other, suspicion festering like a wound. There were vigilante groups forming, fueled by fear and a desperate need for control. They patrolled the streets, often harassing innocent people, especially immigrants who were easy targets for blame. And the saddest part is, those people, they were already trying to survive in brutal conditions. The psychological impact was massive. We can't really know what it was like back then, but imagine the hyper-vigilance, that constant state of alert. The nightmares, the feeling that you were never truly safe. It must have been absolutely exhausting. This kind of sustained fear just eats away at you. Now what about the cops? Well, they were getting roasted. Can you blame them? They promised safety, and they completely failed. The public demanded answers, the press demanded results, and the police, well, they just couldn't deliver. Inspector Aberline, he must have been under immense pressure. Picture him, chasing shadows in those dark alleys, knowing the Ripper could strike again at any moment. The guilt, the frustration, the sheer weight of responsibility, I can't even begin to describe it. The investigation was plagued with problems from the start. For starters, forensic science was still pretty primitive. They didn't have DNA, no fingerprint databases, nothing like that. It was mostly relying on eyewitness accounts and gut feeling. Now, eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable anyway, but especially in a place like Whitechapel, the lighting was poor, people were scared, and many were, well, let's just say they'd had a drink or two. The sheer number of potential suspects was also overwhelming. Whitechapel was teeming with transient workers, sailors, criminals. Anyone could have been the Ripper. Every lead they chased seemed to end in a dead end. Then there was the problem of jurisdiction. The City of London Police and the Metropolitan Police had overlapping areas of responsibility, which led to turf wars and communication breakdowns. Imagine trying to catch a serial killer when the two police forces can't even get along. It's insane. And of course, there were the letters. The Dear Boss letter, the From Hell letter. They grabbed headlines, but they also wasted a huge amount of police time. Most of them were almost certainly hoaxes, written by people looking for attention, but the police had to investigate them anyway. It was a constant stream of false leads. The fact that the Ripper was never caught it's haunting. It's a constant reminder of the limitations of Victorian law enforcement. They were outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and ultimately defeated by a killer who vanished into the fog. That failure had lasting consequences. It damaged public trust in the police, and it left a stain on the reputation of Whitechapel that's still there today. The frustration of the police, I think, also contributed to the theories, the wild theories that still circulate today. Because if you can't find a real answer, people will try to create one. Doesn't matter how crazy the story sounds. The royal conspiracy, the Freemason cover-up, they were all born out of a desire to make sense of the senseless, to find someone powerful to blame when the reality was just too awful to accept. The unsolved mystery of Jack the Ripper continues to fascinate us, of course, because it reminds us that the darkness, it isn't always defeated, sometimes it wins. And that is deeply unsettling, but it's important to remember that behind all the sensationalism, behind the theories and the legends, there were real people who suffered. The victims, their families, the residents of Whitechapel who lived in fear, those dedicated policemen that were not able to catch him. Their stories are the ones we should really be remembering, not the legend of the Ripper himself. Their terror and desperation needs to be remembered, for all time. Alright, settle in folks, because we're diving into the first suspect in the Jack the Ripper case, Montague John Druitt. Now Druitt's story is a bit of a tragic one, and like so many Ripper suspects, the evidence is, well, let's just say it's more suggestive than conclusive. Druitt, born in 1857, was a barrister, meaning he was a lawyer. He came from a pretty well-to-do family, and for a while seemed to have a reasonably promising life ahead of him. He was a cricketer, a sportsman, generally thought of as intelligent and capable. However, there's always a however, isn't there? Druitt's life took a turn, and it's this turn that caught the attention of the police and subsequently Ripperologists. The main reason Druitt became a suspect comes from a note written by Assistant Chief Constable Melville McNayton, a pretty significant figure in the Ripper investigation. McNayton, years after the murders, named Druitt as one of his top 3 suspects. Now, McNayton's note is fascinating, but it's important to keep in mind that it was written after the fact, without the benefit of modern forensic science, and honestly, McNayton wasn't even involved during the heat of the investigation. Still, it's a key piece of the puzzle. McNayton described Druitt as of good family and position, was a doctor, and disappeared shortly after the last murder. He added that Druitt was sexually insane. Now that's quite the accusation, right? But what was McNayton basing this on? Well, the disappearance part is true. Druitt was found dead in the River Thames on December 31st, 1888, a little over a month after the final canonical Ripper murder, that of Mary Jane Kelly. His body was heavily decomposed, suggesting he'd been in the water for a while. The cause of death? Suicide. He'd weighed himself down with stones in his pockets. So, a man matching a vague description of the Ripper, from a respectable background, seemingly vanishes and then is found dead by suicide shortly after the murders stop. It sounds pretty damning, doesn't it? But here's where things get murkier. What about the sexually insane claim? McNayton offers no real evidence for this. It's just stated, and this is one of the biggest problems with the Druitt theory. There's no solid proof linking him to the crimes themselves. See, the Ripper murders were exceptionally brutal, involving specific mutilations of the victims. There was a level of anatomical knowledge displayed that suggested the killer might have some medical training. This is where Druitt, being a doctor, as McNayton claimed, was thought to fit the profile. Except Druitt wasn't a doctor. He was a barrister, a lawyer. He had no known medical training whatsoever. Now, proponents of the Druid theory often argue that MacNaughton was simply mistaken about Druid's profession, or that he might have had some unspecified medical knowledge. But this is where the theory starts to feel a bit flimsy, reliant on speculation rather than hard evidence. There are other points to consider though. Some researchers have suggested that Druid's family may have had a history of mental illness, which might support the sexually insane claim, although again this is based on limited information and is hardly conclusive. It's also worth noting that Druid was reportedly upset about failing to secure a permanent position as a schoolmaster, which could have contributed to his depression and eventual suicide. He was also dismissed by his barrister chambers for reasons that remain shrouded in mystery, adding another layer of stress to his life. Another argument used to bolster Druid's candidacy is his social class. The Ripper murders took place in the impoverished slums of Whitechapel. It was assumed by many that the killer must have been a local, someone familiar with the area and its inhabitants. But Druid, being from a middle-class background, would have had the means to travel to Whitechapel undetected. He wouldn't have necessarily stood out as an outsider, unlike some of the other suspects who were known to live in the area. It's a weak argument at best, of course. However, the biggest problem remains. There is absolutely no concrete evidence placing Druid in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. No witnesses identified him. No physical evidence linked him to the crime scenes. He simply fits a vague profile and then conveniently died. So what are we left with? A promising suspect perhaps, but ultimately one undone by a lack of hard evidence. Druid's suicide certainly raises questions, and it's understandable why MacNaughton considered him a potential culprit. But the Ripper case is notorious for its reliance on speculation and circumstantial evidence, and Druid's case is a prime example of this. In the end, Montague John Druid remains a figure of intrigue, a man whose life ended tragically, and whose name became forever linked to the most infamous unsolved crime in history. But without more substantial evidence, he remains just that, a suspect. A tantalizing lead, perhaps, but one that ultimately fizzles out in the fog of Victorian London. The mystery of the Ripper continues, and we still have many more shadowy figures to examine, so let's keep going. Alright, so tonight we're diving into another suspect in the Jack the Ripper case, Aaron Kosminski. Now this guy's story is a bit of a rabbit hole, and honestly the evidence is, well, let's just say it's more like a tangled web than a smoking gun. Kosminski was a Polish immigrant living in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. He's often described as being mentally unwell, possibly schizophrenic, which back then basically meant he was considered eccentric at best, and a menace at worst. Now right off the bat, that kind of paints a picture, doesn't it? The troubled outsider in a crime-ridden area. It's the kind of narrative that can easily stick. But let's take a breath and actually look at what we know about Kosminski and how it links him to the Ripper killings. A lot of it boils down to circumstantial evidence, and that's where things get really murky. One of the biggest things pointing fingers at Kosminski is the witness testimony of a man named, well, the records are a little fuzzy on the exact name. It's usually given as either Aaron or Israel Schwartz, but there's debate about which, or even if it was a single person. Now Schwartz, or whoever he was, claimed to have seen a man attacking Elizabeth Stride, one of the Ripper's victims, just before she was killed. Here's where it gets tricky. Schwartz said he saw the attacker, and he described him. That description was then used to suggest the attacker was Kosminski. Problem is, there were conflicting reports about what Schwartz actually said. Some accounts say Schwartz described the attacker being of Jewish descent, and obviously Kosminski fit that bill, but other accounts don't mention that at all. Then there's the issue of whether Schwartz actually identified Kosminski. Some sources claim he did. Others say he refused to identify anyone, or that he only identified someone tentatively. You see the problem? we've got blurry details, conflicting reports, and a whole lot of he said, she said surrounding this one crucial witness. The other major piece of evidence that links Kosminski to the Ripper is DNA evidence. Yes, you heard that right. DNA from over a century ago. In 2014, a shawl believed to have been found near Catherine Eddowes, another of the Ripper's victims, was analysed. The analysis claimed to have found mitochondrial DNA matching a living relative of Kosminski. Now this sounds like a slam dunk, right? Except, hold on, there are major questions about the shawl itself. First, there's no solid verifiable evidence that it actually came from the crime scene. Its provenance is sketchy, at best. Second, the way the shawl was handled over the years raises concerns about contamination. Think about it. It's been passed around, stored in various places, potentially touched by countless people. Third, the DNA analysis itself has been heavily criticized. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down through the maternal line, which means lots of people share the same mitochondrial DNA. It can point to a family line, sure, but it's not a unique identifier like a fingerprint. Plus, some scientists have pointed out issues with the specific methods used in the DNA analysis, questioning the reliability of the results. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that while the DNA evidence is intriguing, it's far from conclusive. It's a suggestive piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't definitively solve the whole thing. Adding another layer of complexity to this is the fact that Kosminski spent a good chunk of his later life in mental asylums. Now, being mentally ill doesn't automatically make someone a murderer, but it does raise questions about their ability to function in society, and it certainly would have made him an easy target for suspicion back in Victorian London. It's also worth remembering the social context of the time. Kosminski was a Polish Jewish immigrant in a city rife with anti-Semitism and xenophobia. He was an outsider in a place that didn't exactly welcome outsiders. This prejudice could have easily colored people's perceptions of him and influenced the investigation. Imagine being poor, mentally ill, and from another country. What do you think the police would do? So where does that leave us with Aaron Kosminski? He was definitely a troubled individual who lived in the right place at the wrong time. There's circumstantial evidence that links him to the Ripper murders, but that evidence is riddled with holes. The witness testimony is unreliable, and the DNA evidence is highly contested. The truth is, we don't know for sure if Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. He might have been. He also might have been a convenient scapegoat, a poor, mentally ill immigrant who fit the public's image of a monstrous killer. His story serves as a really important reminder that in true crime, and especially in a case as old and murky as the Ripper murders, it's crucial to be critical of the evidence and to consider the biases that might have influenced the investigation. It's so easy to jump to conclusions, especially when a suspect seems to fit the profile. But sometimes, the most obvious answer isn't necessarily the right one. Okay, so Walter Sickert. This is where things get interesting. Not just because we're dealing with an artist, which always adds a layer of interpretive weirdness, but because the evidence linking him to Jack the Ripper is, let's just say, highly debated. A lot of it hinges on interpretations of his paintings, and that's always a slippery slope, you know. Sickert, born in 1860, was a prominent figure in the art world of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He was influenced by artists like Degas and Whistler, and he painted scenes of everyday life, often focusing on the working class and the seedier side of London. And right there, that's point one. The Ripper victims were the seedier side of London. Sickert painted exactly what the Ripper frequented. But here's where the darkness creeps in. Sickert had a definite macabre fascination. He was drawn to themes of violence, murder, and despair. Some of his paintings depict nude women in unsettling poses, often lying on beds. There's this sense of vulnerability, of something not quite right, that pervades his work. Some people even believe that his father had something to do with a royal murder. What a claim! Now let's talk about the key paintings that fuel the Sickert as Ripper theory. One of the most prominent is the Camden Town murder. Painted in 1908, it depicts a nude woman lying on a bed, with a male figure standing nearby. The scene is dark, shadowy, and unsettling. Now, Sickert claimed it was based on a newspaper account of a murder, but some people see it as a depiction of one of the Ripper killings. The pose of the woman, the overall atmosphere, it just feels Ripper-esque to some. Then there are Sickert's Jack the Ripper's bedroom paintings. These are a series of works depicting a sparsely furnished room, allegedly the room he stayed in Whitechapel. Again, the atmosphere is bleak, desolate, and suggestive of something sinister. Now, Sickert claimed that the title was just a marketing ploy, a way to attract attention to his work. But you know, some people think it was a confession in disguise, a way for him to hint at his dark secret without explicitly admitting it. Patricia Cornwell, the crime novelist, is probably Sickert's most vocal accuser. She's written extensively about her belief that he was Jack the Ripper, even going so far as to destroy one of his paintings in an attempt to extract DNA, which you know is intense. Cornwell argues that Sickert was physically incapable of having sex due to a fistula, and that his paintings were a way for him to act out his repressed desires and violent fantasies. She also claims that his art contains hidden clues and coded messages that point to his guilt. She basically argues that the Ripper case became his sick masterpiece. Now let's talk about the evidence Cornwell and others point to, aside from the paintings themselves. There are some letters, for example, that Sickert wrote that contain phrases and imagery similar to those used in the Dear Boss and From Hell letters. There's also the fact that Sickert lived in Camden Town, which, while not in Whitechapel, isn't that far away. Plus, he had a known fascination with the murders, collecting newspaper clippings and, talking about them a lot. I mean, who wouldn't? But the evidence for the man himself doing it has to stack higher. And that's the problem, really. The evidence is largely circumstantial. There's no definitive proof that Sickert was ever in Whitechapel during the murders, or that he knew any of the victims. The similarities between his letters and the Ripper letters could be coincidental, or simply a result of him being immersed in the same media coverage of the crimes. The art-based evidence is even more problematic. Art is subjective. What one person sees as a depiction of a brutal murder, another might see as a commentary on social inequality or the alienation of modern life. It's all in the eye of the beholder, right? And that fistula that Cornwell talked about, that's also debated. Some medical historians argue that there's no conclusive evidence that Sickert had a fistula, or that it would have rendered him incapable of sex. So a lot of what boils the cauldron with Sickert boils down to an argument on a medical condition. Furthermore, Sickert had alibis for at least some of the murders. He was known to be in France during the time of some of the killings, making it physically impossible for him to have been the Ripper, though some argue that he could have travelled back and forth, secretly. But that sounds like a stretch, doesn't it? Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the Sickert has Ripper theory continues to fascinate people. Why? Well, partly because it's just a compelling story. A famous artist, secretly a brutal killer. It's the stuff of nightmares. It also plays into our cultural obsession with serial killers, and our tendency to see them as somehow monstrous and other. Casting an artist as the Ripper adds an extra layer of psychological complexity to the story. But it's important to be cautious about these kinds of theories. It's easy to fall into the trap of confirmation bias, where you only look for evidence that supports your pre-existing beliefs. And it's also important to remember that accusing someone of being a serial killer is a serious charge, especially when that person... So what's the verdict on Walter Sickert? Was he Jack the Ripper? The evidence as it stands is simply not convincing. He was a troubled, perhaps even disturbed, artist with a macabre fascination. His art is unsettling, and some of his writings are suggestive. But that doesn't make him a serial killer. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and a creepy painting is just a creepy painting. But that doesn't stop it from being on the list. Okay, so we've been deep diving into the gruesome details of Jack the Ripper, right? But here's the thing. He wasn't operating in a vacuum. Victorian England, as shiny and proper as it tried to appear, had a seriously dark underbelly. It wasn't just one bad apple. there was something rotten in the whole orchard. So let's pull back the curtain a bit and peek at some other truly unsettling cases from around the same time. This isn't to excuse the Ripper's actions or to diminish the horror of what happened in Whitechapel. It's more to show you that violence, particularly against vulnerable people, was sadly a recurring nightmare of the Victorian era. Think of it like this: when we focus solely on one sensational crime, we risk losing sight of the broader social context that might have allowed it to happen, maybe even encouraged it. And honestly, the more you dig into this era, the more you realize how pervasive certain kinds of cruelty were. First up, let's talk about the Brighton trunk murders. Now, this is a series of killings that stretch from the 1830s all the way to the 1930s. That's a long time, but the early cases, right around the Ripper's time, are especially chilling. The MO? Dismembered bodies of women, stuffed into trunks and left for anyone to find. In 1831, a trunk was found in a roadside ditch near Brighton, containing the torso of a woman. No head, no limbs, just the trunk. Spooky, right? This one was never solved. Then, fast forward to 1834, and another trunk shows up, this time at a coach office in London. Inside, the dismembered remains of a young woman named Eliza Grimwood. This one was linked to a man named John Bishop, who was eventually hanged. But even then, the trunk murders didn't stop. They just kept popping up, like some recurring nightmare. What's so disturbing about these cases is the cold, calculated nature of the crimes. The sheer effort involved in dismembering a body, stuffing it into a trunk, and then transporting it. It speaks to a chilling level of detachment, and like the Ripper case, the Brighton trunk murders were never really solved. There's the possibility that it wasn't the same killer each time, but the similarities are definitely unsettling. Then there's the case of Mary Eleanor Wheeler, also known as Madam Rachel. Now, she wasn't a killer in the traditional sense, but she was a predator who exploited the desperation and vanity of Victorian women. Madam Rachel ran a beauty salon in London, and she promised her clients the impossible eternal youth, flawless skin, a return to youthful beauty. And how did she do it? With ridiculously overpriced potions, treatments involving Arabian baths, and just plain old lies. Women, often older women desperate to recapture their youth and attractiveness in a society that prized youth above all else, flocked to her salon. They poured their savings into her treatments, hoping for a miracle. But of course there was no miracle. The treatments were bogus, the potions were worthless, and Madam Rachel was a con artist, pure and simple. The truly dark part is that she didn't just take their money, she also played on their insecurities, their fears, their deepest desires. She reinforced the idea that a woman's worth was tied to her appearance, that aging was something to be feared and fought against at all costs. When she was eventually exposed and brought to trial for fraud, the details of her scams were truly appalling, and the sad part is, even after she was convicted, other charlatans rose to take her place, preying on the same vulnerabilities. And if we are talking beauty con artists, we have to mention the chlorodyne craze. This seemingly innocuous medicine that promised to cure everything from coughs to diarrhea, and even insomnia, contained morphine, chloroform and cannabis. People were drinking it like soda pop, especially women. It was readily available at any local pharmacy. Sold as a miracle cure, it in reality was a highly addictive concoction and became a crutch for many people, with the dangerous side effect of poisoning them. And yes, even young children were given the drug. Let's not forget about the brutal treatment of children. We read about baby farmers like Amelia Dyer a bit later, but it was so bad that it needs mentioning right here. Victorian England had a huge problem with unwanted children. Poverty, illegitimacy, societal pressure, lots of reasons why women felt they couldn't raise their own kids, and there were people willing to help, for a price. These baby farmers would take in unwanted children, promising them a good home and loving care. But in reality, many of these children were neglected, abused or even murdered. The baby farming trade was driven by desperation on both sides. The mothers were desperate to find a solution to their unwanted pregnancies, and the baby farmers were desperate for money. But the result was the horrific suffering and death of countless innocent children. It's a dark stain on the Victorian era, a reminder of how easily vulnerable people could be exploited and discarded. So why am I telling you all this? Because as we try to understand the Ripper, it's important to remember that his crimes weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a broader pattern of violence and exploitation, particularly against women and children. This was a society where poverty was rampant, where social inequality was extreme, and where vulnerable people were often seen as disposable. This isn't to say that everyone in Victorian England was a monster, of course not, but there were deep-seated problems that created an environment where these kinds of crimes could flourish. And sadly, the dark secrets of Victorian serial killers are not limited to Jack the Ripper. Alright, so let's shift gears a bit, shall we? From the frustratingly elusive Jack the Ripper, we now turn to another denizen of the Victorian underworld, though one who operated with a decidedly different, shall we say, style. We're talking about Dr. Thomas Neil Cream. Ever heard of him? Probably not as much as the Ripper, right? Cream was known as the Lambeth Poisoner, and well, the name pretty much gives it away. He wasn't slashing up prostitutes in dark alleyways. Instead, he was using poison, specifically strychnine, shiver. Now, while the Ripper terrified London with brutal, up-close violence, Cream preferred a more distant approach. Think of it like this: the Ripper was a hammer, direct, messy, and undeniably terrifying. Cream, on the other hand, was a scalpel, precise, calculated, and leaving a very different kind of horror in his wake. Born in Scotland in 1850, Cream's early life seems, on the surface, relatively unremarkable. He qualified as a doctor from McGill University in Canada. But oh boy, things started getting messy pretty soon, in more ways than one. His first confirmed victim was a young woman named Flora Montgomery. She died after undergoing an abortion performed by Cream. He was accused, but get this, he was acquitted. It just gets better, doesn't it? He then moved to the United States, specifically to Chicago, where he got into even more trouble, like insurance fraud, for starters, leading to the death of his wife, Julia. Insurance scams, you know, strychnine, the usual. This time he was convicted and served time in Joliet prison, released after serving 10 years thanks to some serious backroom dealing. Cream promptly hopped on a boat to London. And that, my friends, is where things got really interesting. Now, the Ripper's victims were, as we discussed, mostly prostitutes working in the impoverished East End. Cream, however, cast a wider net. He seemed to target women he'd come into contact with, sometimes prostitutes, sometimes not. His motivation? Well, that's where things get murky. Some believe it was purely financial, others that he had a deep-seated hatred of women, and others still suggest a bizarre desire for notoriety. One thing that's for certain is that the man loved being the center of attention. His method, strychnine poisoning, is particularly nasty. Strychnine is a neurotoxin that causes agonizing muscle spasms, arching of the back, and ultimately, death by asphyxiation. Think intense cramps, and then, well, not being able to breathe anymore. Now, this is especially worth noting, because this makes it possible that Cream was even active way before the Whitechapel slayings. Some historians believe he might be responsible for other deaths that were simply brushed off as seizures. Let's talk specifics, shall we? One of Cream's first confirmed victims in London was Ellen Donworth, a young prostitute. He gave her pills, claiming they would help her with a certain ailment. Spoiler alert, they did not help. Instead, they contained strychnine. She died in agony. Then there was Matilda Clover, another prostitute. Cream befriended her, and surprise, surprise, she also ended up dead from strychnine poisoning. But here's where it gets truly twisted. Cream actually went to the police and pointed the finger at other people, claiming they were responsible for her death. This guy really. He wanted to be involved in the investigation, to be close to the action, to bask in the attention, even if it meant risking exposure. Now, unlike the Ripper, who left very little in the way of tangible evidence, Cream was almost careless in his actions. He talked too much. He bragged. He made accusations against innocent people. It was almost as if he wanted to be caught, and eventually he was. His downfall came about through a combination of his own hubris and good police work. The police, already on edge thanks to the Ripper murders, were taking poison cases very seriously. They noticed Cream's involvement in multiple suspicious deaths, and his attempts to frame others raised even more red flags. And get this, they had expert witnesses, doctors familiar with Cream and aware of his past, who were able to testify convincingly about the effects of strychnine poisoning. This time, Cream didn't wriggle free. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. But even on the gallows, Cream couldn't resist a final moment of theatricality. According to some accounts, his last words were, "I am Jack the," before the trapdoor sprung. Now, whether he was genuinely trying to confess to being the Ripper, unlikely, given the timeline and geographical inconsistencies, or just trying to create one last sensation, is anyone's guess. But it certainly fits the profile of a man desperate for attention, even at the very end. So what can we take away from the case of Dr. Thomas Neil Cream? Well, it shows us that the Victorian era wasn't just about one type of serial killer. It was a breeding ground for all sorts of depravity. While the Ripper used brute force, Cream used cunning and deception. While the Ripper terrorized the East End, Cream's victims were more diverse. But perhaps the most significant difference is this: the Ripper remains an enigma, a shadowy figure lost to history. Cream, on the other hand, was caught, tried, and executed. He paid for his crimes, and yet, even in death, he couldn't help but try to steal the Ripper's thunder. That, in a nutshell, is the twisted legacy of Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, the Lambeth poisoner. Not as famous as the Ripper, perhaps, but just as dark and just as disturbing. Okay, so tonight we're diving into a particularly grim corner of Victorian history, and honestly, brace yourselves. We're talking about Amelia Dyer, the angel maker, and the horrific trade she built on the desperation of unwed mothers and unwanted children. It's a dark story, but one we need to understand, because it reflects some really ugly truths about Victorian society. Imagine being a young, unmarried woman in Victorian England. Society's already stacked against you, right? If you found yourself pregnant, you were basically ruined. Social stigma, loss of employment, potential ostracization from your family. The options were bleak. Abortion was illegal and dangerous. Adoption, as we know it, barely existed. Desperate times, desperate measures. Enter the baby farmers. These were women, and sometimes men, who offered to care for illegitimate babies for a fee. Sounds okay-ish on the surface, right? A temporary solution, maybe a path to eventual adoption, or even just a safe place for your child while you tried to get back on your feet. But the reality, utterly, heartbreakingly brutal. Most baby farmers were in it for the money, plain and simple. The more babies they took in, the more income they generated. But actually caring for those babies, expensive. Feeding them, housing them, providing medical attention, that cut into the profits. So a lot of these babies suffered neglect, starvation, and downright abuse. Infant mortality rates in these homes were astronomically high. It was a slow, agonizing death sentence. Now Amelia Dyer, she was on another level. She wasn't just neglectful, she was a calculated killer. Dyer started her baby farming operation innocently enough. She was a trained nurse, so she had some knowledge of childcare. Initially, she seems to have genuinely cared for the children she took in. But, and this is a big but, she quickly realized how much more profitable it was to well dispose of them. Her method was chillingly simple. She'd take in a baby, collect a lump sum payment up front, and then strangle it. Wrap the little body in linen, and dump it in the River Thames. Quick, efficient, and from her perspective, profitable. For years she got away with it. The bodies of infants turning up in the Thames were sadly almost commonplace. The police were overworked, under-resourced, and frankly didn't prioritize investigating the deaths of illegitimate children. These were seen as unfortunate accidents, a cost of doing business in a society that stigmatized unwed mothers. It's horrifying, right? These tiny lives were just written off. Dyer moved around frequently, changing her name and addresses to avoid suspicion. She was like a ghost, flitting between towns collecting babies and leaving a trail of death behind her. She was clever, manipulative, and utterly devoid of empathy. The scale of her crimes is mind-boggling. It's impossible to know exactly how many babies she murdered, but estimates range from 200 to 400. Think about that for a second. Hundreds of innocent lives, snuffed out by one woman, driven by greed and a chilling lack of conscience. So how did she get caught? Eventually, Dyer got sloppy. In 1879, she received her first conviction, which was only for neglect, not murder, resulting in 6 months hard labor. After release, she tried to resume baby farming, but due to the increased scrutiny from authorities after her release, resorted to heavy drinking and mental instability, and being admitted into mental asylums multiple times. Each time she was released, she would resume the cycle of taking babies, murdering them, and moving again. In 1896, a bargeman pulled a package from the Thames near Reading. Inside wasn't just a dead baby, but a note with an address on it. That address led back to Dyer. The police raided her home, and what they found was gruesome. The house reeked of decomposition. There was baby clothing, pawn tickets for baby clothes, and letters from mothers desperate for information about their children. But there were no children. Days later, more bodies were found in the Thames, all strangled, all wrapped in the same distinctive linen. The evidence was overwhelming. Dyer was arrested and charged with murder. During her trial, she confessed to knowing nothing about it. Clearly a lie, but it showed her utter detachment from the horror she had inflicted. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. On June 10, 1896, Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison. But Dyer's case didn't just end with her execution. It sparked a public outcry. People were horrified by the scale of the tragedy and the systemic failures that had allowed it to happen. The Dyer case forced Victorian society to confront some uncomfortable truths about poverty, social inequality, and the treatment of vulnerable women and children. The case led to stricter regulations on baby farming, requiring registration and inspection of these homes. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. It also highlighted the desperate need for better social services for unwed mothers and children. Amelia Dyer was an extreme case, a monster who exploited and murdered vulnerable babies for profit. But her story is also a reflection of a society that failed to protect its most vulnerable members. It's a reminder that we need to be vigilant, to challenge injustice, and to fight for a world where every child has a chance at a decent life. Because honestly, the echoes of Dyer's horrific trade still whisper in the shadows of our own society, reminding us that complacency can have deadly consequences, and that is the genuinely awful truth of it all. Alright, settling in now to a darker story, folks. We're swapping out those rolling Virginia hills for something a little more Victorian. Tonight, we're diving deep into the case of Florence Maybrick, the accused poisoner. Her trial was a real national obsession, a scandal that had everyone clutching their pearls. So dim the lights, get cozy, and let's untangle this twisted web of accusations, secrets, and maybe, just maybe, a little arsenic. Florence Maybrick, she wasn't born a Maybrick, mind you. She was born Florence Chandler, way over in Mobile, Alabama, in 1862. Picture her a Southern belle, all charm and supposed innocence. But tragedy struck early. Her father, a prominent businessman, died when she was just a year old. Then her mother remarried a European nobleman. Cue a move to Europe, fancy schools, and a whirlwind of high society events. It's like a novel, right? Now fast forward to 1881. Florence, all of 18 years old, meets James Maybrick, 23 years her senior, he was a wealthy cotton merchant from Liverpool. He's visiting the States, maybe looking for some fresh cotton opportunities, maybe looking for a fresh young wife, a bit of both, probably. They hit it off, or at least he's smitten. They get married soon after, back in London, and Florence finds herself transplanted to the grey skies and, well, interesting social scene of Victorian England. But here's where the fairy tale starts to crack. This isn't some Mills and Boon romance. James, for all his wealth, wasn't exactly husband material. He was known to be, let's say, unfaithful. Affairs were whispered about. Plus, he was a bit of a hypochondriac, always complaining of ailments, constantly dosing himself with all sorts of quack remedies. It's a recipe for marital disaster, really. So the Maybricks settle into their Liverpool home, a place called Battle Crease House. They have children, a son and a daughter. But the marriage continues to sour. Whispers get louder, the affairs become more blatant, and Florence, young and isolated, starts to feel the strain. Some accounts even suggest she started seeking solace elsewhere. Now this is where the story really thickens. In the spring of 1889, James Maybrick falls seriously ill. His symptoms are vague, fluctuating, abdominal pain, vomiting, weakness. He bounces between feeling okay-ish and being terribly sick. Several doctors are called in, each scratching their heads. Was it his usual hypochondria acting up? Was it some sort of exotic disease he'd picked up during his travels? Or was it something more sinister? James' condition worsens over several weeks. Then on May 11th, he dies, suddenly, and that's when all hell breaks loose. Rumours start swirling almost immediately. Whispers about marital discord, whispers about Florence's alleged infidelity, whispers about poison. See, James had been taking medicine that contained strychnine poison in high doses, but sometimes a stimulant at low dosages, and arsenic was another poison widely available during the time, and can be ingested in small doses. The police get involved, an investigation starts, and soon suspicion falls squarely on Florence. Why Florence? Well, several things stacked up against her. First, there was the alleged affair, a juicy bit of scandal that titillated the Victorian public. Second, arsenic was found in her possession, reportedly to use for her complexion, but it looked suspicious. Third, and perhaps most damning, the family maid testified that Florence had asked her to purchase flypaper, which contained arsenic, a short time before James fell ill. And get this, she then boiled the flypaper, presumably to extract the arsenic. Yikes. The trial, held in Liverpool in the summer of 1889, was a sensation. The newspapers went wild, headlines screamed, accusations flew, and the public was utterly gripped. It was a drama worthy of a Gothic novel, all playing out in the courtroom. The prosecution painted Florence as a cold-blooded adulteress, driven by lust and greed to murder her husband. They presented evidence of the arsenic, the flypaper, the alleged affair, and painted a picture of a woman desperate to escape a loveless marriage. The defense, on the other hand, argued that James was a chronic invalid, that he'd been dosing himself with strychnine for years, and that the arsenic found in Florence's possession was for innocent purposes to improve her skin and hair. They also tried to poke holes in the evidence, questioning the maid's testimony and suggesting that James might have accidentally overdosed on his own medication. But here's the thing, the evidence was circumstantial. There was no smoking gun, no direct proof that Florence had actually administered poison to her husband. It was all based on inference and suspicion. Yet the jury, swayed by the moral outrage of the time, and perhaps influenced by the judge's decidedly biased summing up, found Florence guilty of murder. She was sentenced to death. The public was divided. Some cheered the verdict, believing justice had been served. Others, however, felt uneasy. They questioned the strength of the evidence, the fairness of the trial, and the prevailing Victorian prejudices against women who dared to defy social norms. Petitions were launched, protests erupted, and the case became a cause célèbre. Thankfully, Florence's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. She spent the next 15 years in various prisons, always maintaining her innocence. The case continued to be debated and dissected, with new evidence emerging and old theories being re-examined. Then in 1904, after years of tireless campaigning by her supporters, Florence was finally released from prison. She left England and spent the rest of her life in relative obscurity, first in Canada and then back in the United States, dying in 1941. To the very end, she continued to claim she was innocent of her husband's murder. So what really happened at Battle Crease House? Did Florence Maybrick poison her husband? Or was she a victim of circumstantial evidence, a biased legal system, and the moral hypocrisy of Victorian society? The truth is, we may never know for sure. The case remains one of the most fascinating and debated mysteries of the Victorian era. It's a story that speaks to the power of social prejudice, the fallibility of the legal system, and the enduring allure of a good, scandalous murder. And isn't that just the coziest kind of darkness? Alright, settle in folks. Tonight we're diving into a case that's been haunting true crime enthusiasts for over a century, the Borden murders. Picture this, a sweltering August morning in 1892 in Fall River, Massachusetts. A well-to-do family, brutally murdered with an axe, and the prime suspect, their own daughter, Lizzie Borden. Dun dun dun. Now, unlike our friend Jack the Ripper, this case isn't shrouded in the foggy alleyways of Whitechapel. This is small-town America, where whispers carry further than screams. But the mystery, just as chilling. So, who was Lizzie Borden? She was a 32-year-old woman, living with her father Andrew and stepmother Abby. Andrew was a successful businessman, but also known for being, shall we say, frugal. Some might even call him downright stingy. This created tension within the family, especially between Lizzie and her father. Lizzie and her sister Emma felt their stepmother was after their inheritance, and that's not an uncommon family dynamic now, is it? Add in some general unease, a shared house, and you've got a recipe for, well, not murder, hopefully, but definitely for a tense family environment. On that fateful August 4th, Andrew Borden was found dead in the sitting room, struck multiple times with an axe. Abby Borden was discovered upstairs, similarly murdered. The scene was gruesome, to say the least. And Lizzie? She claimed she was in the barn looking for fishing weights at the time of the murders. Now, here's where things get murky. The police investigation was, putting it mildly, not exactly stellar. The crime scene wasn't properly secured, evidence was mishandled, and frankly, some crucial details were overlooked. Victorian forensics, as we've discussed, were not exactly CSI. The axe allegedly used in the murders was found in the basement. However, it wasn't conclusively proven to be the murder weapon. No bloody clothing was ever found. And Lizzie's story? Well, it had some inconsistencies. Small details that shifted in her retelling, which understandably raised suspicion. But here's the kicker. There was no concrete, undeniable evidence linking Lizzie Borden to the crime. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no blood directly connecting her to the murders. It was all circumstantial, a tapestry woven with suspicion and implication. Despite the lack of hard evidence, Lizzie Borden was arrested and put on trial. The trial was a media sensation, a real-life Victorian-era soap opera. The public was captivated, eager to see justice served, or perhaps eager to see a wealthy woman brought down. The prosecution painted Lizzie as a cold, calculating woman, driven by greed and resentment. They highlighted the family tensions, the perceived slight of her stepmother, and the inconsistencies in her story. The defense, however, portrayed Lizzie as a respectable woman, incapable of such a violent act. They argued that the prosecution's case was based on speculation and prejudice, not on solid evidence. And you know what? They were pretty persuasive. The jury, after deliberating for just an hour and a half, acquitted Lizzie Borden, not guilty. Can you believe it? The public was outraged. Many believed Lizzie had gotten away with murder, using her wealth and social standing to escape justice. But the fact remains, the prosecution failed to prove her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So what really happened that day in Fall River? Did Lizzie Borden indeed take an axe and give her parents 40 whacks? Or was she an innocent woman, wrongly accused and subjected to a public trial by fire? The truth is, we may never know for sure. The lack of conclusive evidence, the mishandling of the crime scene, and the passage of time have all conspired to keep the Borden murders shrouded in mystery. But let's look at the possibilities, shall we? One theory is that Lizzie acted alone, driven to a breaking point by years of simmering resentment. Perhaps a heated argument with her father or stepmother triggered a violent outburst, leading to the horrific crime. Another theory suggests that Lizzie had an accomplice, perhaps a secret lover, or someone else with a motive to harm the Bordens. This would explain the lack of physical evidence directly linking Lizzie to the murders. Then there's the possibility that someone else entirely committed the crime. A disgruntled employee, a rival businessman, or even a complete stranger. This theory is less popular, but it can't be entirely dismissed. And finally, there's the controversial theory that Lizzie was actually protecting someone else, perhaps her sister, Emma, or another family member. This would explain her inconsistent statements and her willingness to shoulder the blame. Regardless of the truth, the Borden murders have had a lasting impact on American culture. The case has been the subject of countless books, movies, and even a nursery rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. A chilling rhyme that, while catchy, may not be entirely accurate. The actual number of blows varied depending on the victim. But hey, artistic license, right? After the trial, Lizzie Borden lived a relatively quiet life in Fall River, though she was always ostracized by much of the community. She changed her name to Lizbeth A. Borden and inherited a substantial amount of money from her father's estate. She spent her remaining years involved in the arts and animal welfare, but the shadow of the murders always lingered over her. Lizzie Borden died in 1927, at the age of 68. She never confessed to the murders, and the case remains officially unsolved. Was she guilty? Was she innocent? The mystery endures, a chilling reminder of the dark secrets that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most respectable families. So what do you think? Did Lizzie Borden get away with murder, or was she the victim of a flawed investigation and a prejudiced public? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And until next time, sleep tight, and maybe double check the locks on your doors, just in case. Alright, settle in friends, because this is where things get really gritty. We're not just talking about individual killers anymore, but the entire ecosystem that allowed them to thrive. Picture this: Victorian London, a powerhouse of empire, right? Towering buildings, technological marvels, but underneath all that, a festering underbelly of poverty, desperation, and just plain brutal conditions. We're talking about a society sharply divided. You've got your glittering elite, sipping tea and attending operas, completely disconnected from the sheer misery brewing just a few streets away. And then you have everyone else, a massive sprawling underclass, struggling to survive, packed into overcrowded slums, and facing unimaginable hardship. It's this environment, this breeding ground of despair, that provides the backdrop for the horrors we've been discussing. Think about Whitechapel, where Jack the Ripper stalked his victims. It wasn't just a random neighborhood. It was a concentrated pocket of poverty, a place where people were forced to live in conditions that were frankly inhumane. Imagine squeezing your entire family into a single room, maybe even sharing it with another family. No running water, no sanitation, disease spreading like wildfire. Can you even fathom the daily grind of simply trying to exist in that situation? And what options did people have? For many women, especially those who were widowed or abandoned, prostitution was often the only way to survive. It was a brutal, dangerous life, but it was a life, and this is key to understanding the Ripper case. Prostitution wasn't some fringe activity. It was widespread, almost normalized within these communities, because there simply weren't other opportunities. And unfortunately, this made these women incredibly vulnerable. They were already marginalized, often invisible to mainstream society. Who would truly care if one more unfortunate disappeared from the streets? But it wasn't just women facing these challenges. Men struggled too. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and competition was fierce. The workhouses, intended as places of last resort, were often deliberately made horrific to discourage people from seeking assistance. The idea was to force people to be self-sufficient, but in reality, it just created even more desperation and resentment. This economic pressure cooker led to a rise in all sorts of crime. Petty theft, street brawls, and gang violence were commonplace. People were desperate, willing to do anything to feed themselves and their families. And in this chaotic environment, violent individuals could easily slip through the cracks. The police were overwhelmed, under-resourced, and often more focused on maintaining order in wealthier areas. Whitechapel and places like it were essentially left to fend for themselves. Now let's talk about alcohol. It was a huge problem. Gin palaces were everywhere, offering a cheap escape from the harsh realities of daily life. But alcohol fueled violence, both domestic and on the streets. It lowered inhibitions, making people more susceptible to anger and aggression. And it contributed to a cycle of poverty, as families spent what little money they had on drink instead of food or necessities. It was a depressingly vicious cycle. And what about children? So many were forced to work from a young age, often in dangerous conditions. They were chimney sweeps, factory workers, street vendors, their childhoods stolen from them by the demands of survival. They were incredibly vulnerable, exposed to all sorts of abuse and exploitation. You're talking about a whole generation growing up in a world saturated with violence and devoid of opportunity. So think about it. You have extreme poverty, widespread prostitution, rampant alcoholism, and a desperate underclass struggling to survive in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. All of this is happening in the shadows of a wealthy and powerful empire. It's a recipe for disaster. It's a breeding ground for crime, violence, and ultimately for the kind of horrific acts that we associate with Victorian serial killers. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a much larger problem, a society that had created a vast underclass and then largely ignored its suffering. The conditions in Victorian London and other industrial cities created a perfect storm for crime and violence to flourish. Understanding this context is essential to understanding the darkness that gripped the era and the enduring fascination we have with those who emerged from its shadows. So when we talk about the Ripper or any other Victorian killer, let's remember the world they inhabited, the world that in many ways helped to create them. Because without that understanding, we're only seeing half the picture. And it's a much more disturbing picture when you see the whole thing. Alright, let's dim the lights a little bit, get comfy, and ease into this. Tonight we're going to delve into a pretty unsettling corner of Victorian England, the intertwined dance of gender, violence, and the disturbing sexualization that often clung to the era's infamous murders. Now before we dive into the specifics of our grisly subject matter, it's crucial to paint a picture of the Victorian era's attitudes towards women. Society back then, let's be real, it was suffocating. Women were largely relegated to the domestic sphere. Their roles were rigidly defined, primarily as wives, mothers, and keepers of the home. They were expected to be pure, obedient, and above all silent. A woman's value was in so many ways tied directly to her reputation and her perceived virtue. Think about the language itself. fallen woman, a term used to describe women who had engaged in sex outside of marriage, particularly heartbreaking. It paints the picture of something once beautiful, corrupted and ruined, simply for not adhering to those suffocating standards. This wasn't just a social stigma, it could mean complete ostracization, loss of family, and a descent into poverty. This is where prostitution comes into the picture, isn't it? For many women in Victorian England, especially those living in poverty-stricken areas like Whitechapel, prostitution was often the only viable option for survival. Imagine the desperation, the lack of choices, the constant vulnerability. Prostitution wasn't some glamorous, romanticized career. It was a brutal reality, born from poverty, desperation, and a system that offered women little other economic opportunity. It was a dangerous, precarious existence, and it made these women particularly vulnerable to violence. And here's where things get truly twisted. The Victorian era was also an era of well-repressed sexuality. There was this fascination with the female form, this undercurrent of forbidden desire, all carefully concealed beneath layers of societal propriety. This repression, unfortunately, played a role in how violence against women was viewed, even sensationalized. Now let's talk about the Ripper murders specifically. The victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. They were all women of the night, and the press, boy did they have a field day with it. The way these murders were reported, it wasn't just about the loss of life, it was about their immorality, the wickedness of their profession. See, the media often framed these women as somehow deserving of their fate. They were asking for it by engaging in prostitution. This rhetoric, of course, is incredibly damaging and completely wrong. It shifts the blame from the perpetrator to the victim, excusing the violence and reinforcing those harmful societal attitudes. You see the headlines, the gruesome details, the speculation about their lives, the implications that they were somehow less worthy of protection because of their choices. It created this atmosphere of fear and moral panic, but it also had this dark undercurrent of titillation. The press exploited these women's lives and their deaths for profit, feeding into the public's morbid curiosity and reinforcing those damaging stereotypes. Think about the Ripper letters too. The Dear Boss letter, the From Hell letter. They're taunting, gruesome, and shockingly theatrical. They played into this image of the Ripper as this almost mythical, larger-than-life figure of terror. And even the way the murders were described, they often focused on the mutilation of the victims' bodies. It speaks to the sexualized nature of the violence itself, a display of power and control over women. And it's not just about the crimes themselves, but how the police and society responded. There was an initial wave of outrage, sure, but it was often tinged with this indifference, this reluctance to fully invest in protecting these women. Because let's face it, they were prostitutes, they were poor, they were marginalized, their lives were seen as less valuable. The Ripper case, sadly, laid bare the deep-seated misogyny of Victorian society. It exposed the hypocrisy, the double standards, the way women were devalued and seen as objects, rather than individuals deserving of respect and protection. Even the search for the Ripper became entangled in gendered assumptions. Many theories focused on male suspects with supposed sexual deviancies. This hyper-focus on the male psyche and the assumptions that violence was inherently a male trait, it kind of obscured the broader societal factors that contributed to the violence against women in general. So, what's the takeaway here? The Ripper murders weren't just random acts of violence. They were a product of a society that devalued women, that exploited the poor, and that allowed violence against marginalized groups to fester. By understanding the gendered context of these crimes, we can hopefully start to dismantle those harmful attitudes and create a more just and equitable world, right? I know that sounds a little high-minded, but well, these women deserve that much, don't you think? Okay, just gonna let that sink in for a moment before we move on. Alright, settle in folks, because this section is all about the chaotic dance between the police and the press during the Victorian era. It's a story of shared needs, clashing egos, and enough sensationalism to make your head spin. Imagine trying to solve a crime in the middle of a screaming match, and you're getting close to understanding what Inspector Abberline and his men were up against. So picture the scene. Whitechapel is gripped by terror. Every new murder cranks up the public hysteria. And who's there, ready to amplify that fear and fascination? You guessed it, the Victorian press. Newspapers were booming during this period. Readership was soaring, and competition was fierce. Every paper was desperate to grab headlines, to sell more copies, and to become the voice of authority on the Ripper case. And that meant sensationalism. Now, sensationalism is a big word, but the idea is pretty simple. It's all about exaggerating the details of a story to make it more exciting, more shocking, and ultimately more profitable. The Ripper murders were tailor-made for sensationalism. You had gruesome violence, a shadowy killer, and a terrified public. What's not to love? For a newspaper editor anyway. The press didn't hold back. Graphic descriptions of the crime scenes, often embellished, were splashed across front pages. Rumors and speculation were presented as facts. You name it, they printed it. They fueled the panic, sometimes deliberately, because panic sold papers. Think about the Dear Boss letter. Now, we talked about this earlier, but it's worth remembering in this section. Was it actually written by the Ripper? Maybe, maybe not. But the press ran with it. They printed it, they analyzed it, and they amplified it, turning the author into a celebrity of sorts. The name Jack the Ripper itself came from that letter, and it stuck. The press created the Ripper's persona, a monster lurking in the shadows, taunting the police and terrorizing the city. But here's where the relationship gets complicated. The police needed the press, even though they hated them. Newspapers were the primary way to communicate with the public. If the police wanted to appeal for information, to issue warnings, or to try and calm the public's fears, they had to go through the newspapers. The press also acted as a kind of public watchdog. They scrutinized the police investigation, they criticized their failures, and they demanded answers. Now, this could be incredibly frustrating for the police, especially when they were struggling to find any real leads. But it also kept them accountable. Knowing that their every move was being watched and dissected by the press forced them to be more diligent, more transparent, and hopefully more effective. However, this also led to a pretty toxic dynamic. The police were desperate to control the narrative, to manage the flow of information, and to prevent anything that might hinder their investigation. The press, on the other hand, was desperate for scoops, for exclusive details, and for anything that would give them an edge over their competitors. This led to a constant tug of war. The police would leak information to favored journalists in exchange for positive coverage. The press would try to bribe or trick police officers into revealing secrets. And sometimes, the police would simply refuse to cooperate with the press altogether, leading to even more speculation and rumor-mongering. One of the biggest issues was the spread of misinformation. The press often printed rumors and theories without verifying them, which could lead the police down blind alleys. They also sensationalized the crimes in ways that made it harder for potential witnesses to come forward. People were scared, they were confused, and they didn't know who to trust. The From Hell letter, with the alleged kidney fragment, is a prime example of this. Was it real? Was it a hoax? The press debated it endlessly, but the facts were often lost in the sea of speculation. The police had to waste valuable time and resources investigating every lead, no matter how dubious, because the public demanded it. The constant pressure from the press also took a toll on the police officers themselves. They were working long hours, dealing with horrific crime scenes, and facing relentless public scrutiny. Many of them were underqualified and to deal with a case of this magnitude. The press coverage just added to the stress and the pressure. The relationship between the police and the press during the Ripper murders was a complex and often contradictory one. They needed each other, but they also distrusted each other. The press fueled the public hysteria, but they also held the police accountable. The police tried to control the narrative, but they also relied on the press to communicate with the public. Ultimately, the sensationalism of the Victorian press shaped the way the Ripper murders were perceived, both then and now. It created the legend of Jack the Ripper, the shadowy monster who has haunted our imaginations for over a century. It also made it incredibly difficult for the police to solve the case, and contributed to the atmosphere of fear and paranoia that gripped Whitechapel. And that, my friends, is the dark side of the news cycle, Victorian edition. A reminder that even in the pursuit of truth, the lure of a good story can sometimes lead us astray. So next time you're reading a sensational headline, take a moment to remember the Ripper case and ask yourself, is this really the truth or just a good story? Alright, let's dive into the rather limited world of Victorian forensic science. It's kind of shocking how rudimentary it all was, especially when you compare it to what we have today. So picture this. It's the late 1800s. Gas lamps flicker in the streets, casting long dancing shadows, and well, the state of crime scene investigation, not exactly CSI, more like chaotic observation. The big problem was, actual science was just starting to be applied to crime. Before that, gut instinct and circumstantial evidence were the stars of the show. Now, we're not talking about DNA analysis or even decent fingerprinting. That stuff was science fiction. What they did have was basic observation skills and a whole lot of guesswork. One major hurdle was just a lack of communication and standardized practices. Different police forces operated independently. If a killer skipped town, sharing info across districts was slow, cumbersome, often relying on word of mouth and handwritten letters. Forget databases or national crime labs. Everything was hyper-local. Technology, barely a blip on the radar. Photography existed, sure, but it was expensive, time-consuming, and the image quality, let's just say, it wasn't exactly high definition. Imagine trying to document a crime scene with a big, clunky camera and long exposure times. And forget about capturing details in low light. Those gas lamps just weren't cutting it. Sketches were often used, but relied heavily on the artist's accuracy. If the constable drawing the scene couldn't draw, the sketch was often useless. Bloodstain pattern analysis. Nope. Serology, which is the study of blood and other bodily fluids, still in its infancy. They could maybe tell if something was blood, but figuring out where it came from or how it got there, highly unlikely. The idea of using blood spatter to reconstruct a crime was decades away. Then there's the issue of fingerprints. The concept was around, thanks to the work of people like Henry Folds and William James Herschel, but it wasn't really used in criminal investigations on any reliable basis until later. In the early 20th century, the Ripper crimes were just a little too early. Even basic things like crime scene preservation were, well, primitive. Crowds of onlookers would often tramp through crime scenes, contaminating evidence. Police officers, often untrained in forensics, might accidentally disturb or even remove crucial clues. The concept of cordoning off a crime scene and protecting it from contamination was just not part of the general public awareness. Autopsies, while more established, weren't always performed thoroughly. Medical examiners, sometimes local doctors with limited forensic pathology experience, focused mainly on determining the cause of death. Subtle details, like trace evidence or specific wound characteristics that could help identify a killer, were often overlooked. Plus, there were social sensitivities to autopsies. Gaining permission to perform one could be tricky, especially for victims from poorer backgrounds. And speaking of social issues, class bias definitely played a role. Crimes against wealthier victims tended to get more attention and resources, while those in poorer areas like Whitechapel were often dismissed or given less priority. This lack of attention to detail and the casual attitudes of officers meant that crucial pieces of evidence simply went unnoticed and uncollected. Adding to the problems, the understanding of decomposition was pretty limited. Time of death estimates were often based on guesswork and rough observations of body temperature. Factors like environmental conditions and individual body variations were rarely taken into account. In warmer weather, decomposition happened quickly, making accurate time of death estimations even more challenging. The lack of scientific rigor was compounded by reliance on eyewitness testimony. Now, eyewitnesses can be notoriously unreliable, even today, but back then, with no psychological understanding of memory or suggestion, witness accounts were often accepted at face value, even when inconsistent or contradictory. Also, they didn't know about things that seem obvious now, like how easy it is to transfer fibers between people, or how a tiny speck of paint can link a suspect to a crime scene. These are basics in modern forensic science, but they were just mysteries in the Victorian era. Basically, imagine trying to solve a complex jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing and a blurry picture on the box. That's what Victorian crime scene investigation was like. It's no wonder so many cases went unsolved, and it's also no surprise that a killer like Jack the Ripper could operate with relative impunity, leaving a trail of terror but few concrete clues that the authorities could actually use to catch him. It's a little depressing, isn't it? To think that so much violence went unchecked, not necessarily due to incompetence, but because the tools and knowledge simply didn't exist. Still, it's important to remember that these limitations were the starting point, the slow, sometimes frustrating, beginning of modern forensics. They were doing their best with what they had, paving the way for the science-driven crime solving we take for granted today. And honestly, knowing how far we've come makes it a little less sad and a little more interesting. So we've spent all this time digging into the minds and the methods of these Victorian-era killers. Jack the Ripper, Dr. Cream, Amelia Dyer, each one a horrifying testament to the darkness that can lurk within. But let's step back for a moment, because there's a question that's probably been nagging at you, maybe even a little bit uncomfortably. Why do we care? Why are we right now spending our time talking about these awful people? Why are we fascinated by serial killers? It's a pretty uncomfortable question, isn't it? No one wants to think they have a morbid curiosity. We like to think we're drawn to stories of heroism, of justice prevailing, of light conquering darkness, and on some level, that's probably true. But serial killers, they represent the opposite of all that. They're the darkness winning, the system failing, innocence destroyed. So what's the draw? Well, there are a few different theories that psychologists have put forward. One of the most common is the idea of the forbidden fruit. We're told from a very young age that certain things are wrong, that certain behaviors are taboo. Murder, violence, inflicting pain, these are all things that are drilled into us as being unacceptable. But that very prohibition can make them strangely compelling. It's like that sign that says, "Don't push the big red button." Immediately, you want to know what happens if you do push it. Serial killers represent a complete and utter rejection of those societal rules. They do the things we're told we can't, and they often seem to get away with it, at least for a while. That defiance, that transgression can be strangely alluring, even if it's also repulsive. It's a peek into a world without rules, a world where anything is possible, no matter how horrific. Another theory revolves around the idea of control. In our daily lives, we're constantly bombarded with things we can't control. We can't control the economy. We can't control the weather. We often can't even control what happens to us at work. Life can feel chaotic and unpredictable, but serial killer cases, we can dissect them, analyze them, try to understand them. We can impose order on the chaos, at least in our minds. We can create narratives, assign motives, and ultimately feel like we have some degree of control over something that is inherently uncontrollable. Think about it. We pore over crime scene photos, we read psychological profiles, we debate theories about motive. We're trying to build a framework to understand the why behind the seemingly random acts of violence. And in doing so, we're creating a sense of distance, a sense of separation between ourselves and the killer. We're saying, I could never do that. I understand this person, but I am fundamentally different from them. There's also the element of fear and how we process it. Humans are hardwired to be afraid of danger. It's a survival mechanism. But we also have a strange tendency to be drawn to the things that scare us. Horror movies, roller coasters, they allow us to experience fear in a controlled environment, a safe space. We get that adrenaline rush, that surge of primal emotion, without actually being in any real danger. Serial killer stories can function in a similar way. They allow us to confront our fears about violence, about the unknown, about the darkness that might exist within ourselves and others. We can explore those fears from a safe distance, knowing that we're not actually in any immediate harm. It's like a form of psychological inoculation, a way of preparing ourselves for the possibility of danger, even if that danger seems remote. Then there's the simple fact that serial killer cases are often incredibly complex and puzzling. They're like intricate puzzles with missing pieces, and we as armchair detectives are drawn to the challenge of trying to solve them. We want to figure out the who, the how, and most importantly, the why. We want to understand the killer's motivations, their thought processes, their background. We want to connect the dots and bring order to the chaos. It's a compelling intellectual exercise, even if the subject matter is deeply disturbing. And finally, let's not forget the cultural impact. Serial killers have become a staple of our popular culture, from movies and TV shows to books and podcasts. We're constantly bombarded with fictionalized versions of these figures, often romanticized or sensationalized. This constant exposure can desensitize us to the true horror of their crimes and make them seem almost normal. That's not to say that all true crime media is inherently bad, but it's important to be mindful of the way these stories are being presented and the impact they might be having on us. So are we all secretly potential serial killers, just waiting for the right trigger? Absolutely not. The vast majority of people are horrified by violence and would never dream of harming another human being. But the fascination with serial killers taps into something deep within us, a complex mix of fear, curiosity, a desire for control, and a strange fascination with the forbidden. It's a dark and uncomfortable subject, but it's important to understand why we're drawn to these stories. Because by understanding our fascination, we can better understand ourselves, our fears, and the things that truly matter to us. And maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to channel that curiosity into something more productive, something that helps us prevent these kinds of atrocities from happening in the first place. Okay, so you know we've spent a lot of time talking about some pretty grim stuff. Jack the Ripper, poisoners, and baby farmers. But these stories, as dark as they are, have woven themselves into the fabric of our culture. And that's what we're diving into now, how these Victorian villains have shaped our books, movies, and pretty much everything in between. Let's start with the obvious one, Jack the Ripper. I mean, the Ripper is basically the poster child for historical serial killers in fiction. He's been reimagined countless times, appearing as everything from a shadowy figure in graphic novels like From Hell to a supernatural monster in video games like Assassin's Creed Syndicate. And it's not just direct adaptations. The Ripper's influence seeps into countless thrillers and horror stories. Think about the archetype of the mysterious, intelligent killer who taunts the police and disappears into the fog. That owes a huge debt to the Ripper narrative. Even modern serial killer fiction, like Thomas Harris's Hannibal Lecter series, draws inspiration from the Ripper's mystique and the public's fascination with evil. But it's more than just the whodunit. The Ripper's story is a perfect storm of elements that resonate with audiences. The gritty Victorian setting, the social anxieties around class and gender, and the sheer terror of the unknown. Writers and filmmakers have played with these elements for decades, using the Ripper as a lens to explore deeper themes about society, morality, and the nature of violence. Think about the film Murder by Decree, 1979, starring Christopher Plummer and James Mason. It portrays a Sherlock Holmes investigation into the Ripper killings, connecting the crimes to a Freemason conspiracy. Or the more recent series Ripper Street, which takes a procedural approach, focusing on the police detectives tasked with hunting the killer in the immediate aftermath of the murders. Each adaptation uses the Ripper mythos to tell a different story, reflecting the anxieties and preoccupations of its own time. Now, it's not just the Ripper who's left his mark. Amelia Dyer, that horrifying baby farmer, has also inspired fictional works. While she might not be as widely known as the Ripper, her crimes are equally chilling. The idea of someone preying on vulnerable women and infants, profiting from their desperation, is a deeply disturbing one. Dyer's story has been explored in novels and plays, often highlighting the social conditions that allowed her to operate for so long. The lack of regulation around childcare, the poverty that drove women to abandon their children, and the societal pressure on unmarried mothers. These are all themes that writers have explored through the lens of Dyer's crimes. While fictional works don't always explicitly name Amelia Dyer, they've certainly been influenced by the real events of her case. Then there are the other Victorian killers, like Dr. Cream and Florence Maybrick. While their cases might not be as sensationalized as the Rippers, they offer writers a chance to explore different aspects of Victorian society. Cream's story, for instance, allows for an examination of the medical profession, the abuse of power, and the dangers of unchecked ambition. Maybrick's case, on the other hand, opens up a window into the lives of wealthy families, the constraints placed on women, and the biases of the legal system. Even the Borden murders, though technically taking place in America, fit into this Victorian-era narrative of domestic tension and hidden violence. The image of Lizzie Borden wielding an axe has become iconic, a symbol of repressed anger and societal expectations gone awry. The Borden case has inspired numerous books, films, and even a popular skipping rhyme, all perpetuating the mystery and the dark allure of the story. The fact that the case remains unsolved only adds to its appeal, but the influence of these killers extends beyond just direct adaptations or fictionalizations of their crimes. They've also shaped the broader genre of crime fiction, influencing the way we think about serial killers, detectives, and the nature of evil. The Victorian era, with its social contrasts and technological limitations, provides a fertile ground for stories that explore the dark side of human nature. Think about the detective stories of Arthur Conan Doyle. Sherlock Holmes, with his keen intellect and scientific approach to crime solving, is a direct response to the real-life frustrations of the Ripper investigation. The police were baffled, unable to catch the killer using traditional methods. Holmes, on the other hand, represents a new kind of crime solver, one who relies on observation, deduction, and forensic science, even if those methods were still in their infancy at the time. And it's not just the detectives. The Victorian era also gave rise to a new kind of villain, the charismatic, intelligent criminal who operates outside the bounds of morality. Think of Professor Moriarty, Holmes's nemesis. He's not just a thug or a madman, but a brilliant mathematician and criminal mastermind. This archetype of the intelligent villain, capable of both great evil and great charm, has become a staple of crime fiction, and it owes a debt to the real-life killers who captivated and terrified Victorian society. The legacy of these Victorian serial killers is complex and unsettling. While their crimes are undeniably horrific, they've also become a source of fascination and inspiration for artists and writers. By exploring these dark stories, we can learn something about ourselves, about our fears, and about the societies that created these killers in the first place. It's not about glorifying violence or celebrating evil, but about understanding the human capacity for darkness and the social conditions that can contribute to it. And that's why, even today, we are still so fascinated by these crimes. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world around us, and they remind us that even in the most civilized of societies, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface. Alright, so Victorian serial killers, huh? It's a tough topic, and honestly, if you've made it this far in the video, you deserve a medal. Or maybe just a really long nap, because, it's heavy stuff. We've talked about Jack the Ripper, Dr. Cream, Amelia Dyer, even Lizzie Borden across the pond. We've dove into the gritty realities of Victorian London and beyond. But here's the thing, and it's super important to remember, a lot of these cases they're unsolved. Jack the Ripper, obviously. Despite all the theories, the books, the films, the countless hours of amateur sleuthing, we still don't know who he was. Montague Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, Walter Sickert, all compelling suspects, all with tantalizing pieces of evidence, but none of it definitive. It's like chasing shadows, you know. You think you've got something, and then it just slips through your fingers. It's frustrating, and it's sad. The families of those women, they never got closure, and honestly, that just feels wrong. And it's not just the Ripper. Even with cases like Florence Maybrick, where there was a conviction, there's still so much doubt. Did she really poison her husband? Was she a victim of a biased legal system? Was it just a terribly unhappy marriage gone wrong? We just don't know for sure. The Borden case? Absolute chaos of conflicting accounts and missing evidence. These unsolved mysteries, they linger, they become part of the cultural landscape, they fuel our imaginations, our anxieties, our darkest fears, and that's kind of the point, isn't it? These events cast long shadows. Think about Whitechapel after the Ripper murders. That area was already struggling with poverty, overcrowding, and social unrest. But the Ripper, he amplified all of that. The fear was palpable. People were afraid to walk the streets at night. Women were especially vulnerable. And the police, well, they seemed utterly powerless to stop it. The whole thing just created this atmosphere of dread. And it wasn't just Whitechapel, the fear spread. People started seeing monsters everywhere. Every shadow, every dark alley, every stranger became a potential Ripper. It tapped into this primal fear that, you know, anyone could be capable of such horrific violence. That lurking darkness is still there, just under the surface. And that brings us to the bigger picture. What can we learn from studying these cases? Is it just morbid curiosity, or is there something more to it? I think it's a mix, honestly. There's definitely a fascination with the macabre. Human beings are weird like that. We're drawn to the dark side, to the things that scare us. But I also think there's a desire to understand, to figure out why these things happened, to see if we can prevent them from happening again. And that's where it gets tricky, ethically. Because when we study these cases, we're dealing with real people, real victims, real families, and we have to be respectful of that. We can't just sensationalize their stories for entertainment. We have a responsibility to treat them with dignity and compassion. We also have to be careful about glorifying the perpetrators. It's easy to get caught up in the mystique of Jack the Ripper, to romanticize him as some kind of criminal mastermind. But he wasn't. He was a brutal killer who preyed on vulnerable women, and we shouldn't forget that. So how do we study this dark history responsibly? I think it starts with empathy, trying to understand the context in which these crimes occurred, the social, economic, and political factors that contributed to the violence. And remembering that these weren't just abstract historical events, they were real tragedies that affected real people. It means avoiding sensationalism and focusing on the facts. It means acknowledging the limitations of our knowledge and not trying to create neat, tidy narratives where they don't exist. It means being honest about the unsolved nature of these cases and recognizing that we may never know the full truth. And it means being mindful of the impact our words can have. The victims of these crimes can no longer speak for themselves. We have a responsibility to tell their stories with respect and accuracy, to honor their memory, and to never forget the horrors they endured. Ultimately, studying Victorian serial killers isn't about titillation or entertainment. It's about understanding the darkness that lurks within us all. It's about confronting the uncomfortable truths about our history and society. And it's about striving to create a better world where such tragedies never happen again. So yeah, that was intense. If you need a break, seriously, go get some tea, pet a cat, watch something fluffy, because sometimes you just need to escape the shadows for a little while. But thanks for sticking with me. Thanks for being willing to confront the darkness. It's not easy, but it's important. And until next time, sleep tight, okay? Don't let the Ripper bite.